In the war nursery of Carviriel, hatred was not taught with words. It was poured like molten metal into the bones. The chamber lay deep beneath the obsidian capital, carved from bedrock smoothed by dragon claws over centuries. Walls of living crystal showed shifting constellations, slowly rotating in the dark. Each star tagged with some imperial victory the hatchlings would one day be made to avenge. Overhead, luminescent veins pulsed faintly, mimicking a heart that belonged not to any living creature, but to the empire itself. 6 dragon hatchlings sprawled in the central nest, a shallow basin of warm stone and woven sensor filaments. They were all teeth and elbows, and oversized heads, scales still soft with youth, wings too big for their bodies. Their colors were those of a dying star, bronze and ember, black shot through, with green deep cobalt edged in silver, each hatchling a different thread of a long and terrible lineage. They should have been playing. Instead, they practiced snarling at a hologram. The image flickered above the nest, life-sized and exquisitely detailed. A human soldier in battle armor froze mid-motion, mouth open as if shouting an order. The figure rotated slowly, exposing every angle, the clumsy bipedal posture, the bare skin at the throat, the pale hands gripping a rifle. To the dragon's eyes, the human looked both fragile and dangerous, the way a knife made of glass might look. "Attention," rumbled Warden Krall, the elder dragon assigned to their upbringing. His voice rolled through the nursery like distant thunder. He was enormous even by his species standards, scales dark and dull with age, the ridge of his back scarred by 100 old battles. His left eye was milky, blind. His right burned like an ember low in a fire. "What is this? Brood?" "Enemy," hissed the largest hatchling, a bronze-scaled male whose frills were already beginning to harden into something that would someday be regal. He bared his mound, tiny teeth, smoke curling from his nostrils. Terran, human, the soft ones, the treacherous ones. The others took up the words, voices overlapping, half growl, half chirp. Human, soft, treacherous, enemy. Warden Krall's lips pulled back, exposing teeth the size of knives. It was not quite a smile. "Good," he said. Again, the image changed. Now it showed a human medic, armor stripped down to a chest plate, sleeves rolled to the elbow. Her hands were pressed to the chest of a wounded dragon trooper, human fingers slick with alien blood. In the background, smoke and fire blurred into the chaos of a battlefield. Her face was streaked with soot. Her jaw was clenched in concentration. The hatchlings hissed on instinct, scales bristling. The medic's expression, intense, focused, strangely gentle, baffled them more than the battle scene around her. "She helps," said one of the smaller hatchlings, a cobalt female with a faint silver stripe along her spine. Her eyes narrowed. "She is repairing. She is lying," Warden Krall snapped, tail striking the stone with a crack that made dust fall from the ceiling. "Terrans wield mercy as a weapon. They make you lower your guard. They make you think they care. Then they leash you. They cut your wings. They write rules and call it peace." He stepped into the nest, his massive shadow swallowing half the hologram. The hatchlings pressed themselves against the warm stone, thrumming faintly with the instinctive urge to obey. "In the last war, humans refused to burn when we burned them," he said, bitterness etched into every syllable. "They refused to kneel when we scorched their worlds. They bargained instead. They made treaties. They treated our wounded. They fed our prisoners. They ended our expansion without even spilling enough of our blood to make a ballad. That is not honor. That is theft." The bronze hatchling's frills flared. "They stole our war," he growled, not fully understanding, but absorbing the emotion like heat. "Yes," Warden Krall said softly. "They stole your rightful fire. Remember this." He shifted the hologram again. Now it showed human hospital ships coasting through the wreckage of a battlefield. White hulls stark against the black. Their design was inelegant by Drakkar standards, boxy, utilitarian, but they moved with a stubborn purpose, lights flickering as they broadcast universal calls for ceasefire. The brood watched, fascinated despite themselves, as tiny pinnaces shuttled between the ships and broken cruisers bearing the Empire's crest. The dragons in those images were wounded, unmoving. The humans moved around them like pale insects, attaching lines, lifting, treating. "Never trust a hand that offers help," Warden Crawl said. "Ask instead, what do they want to own?" The hatchlings stared, hearts beating fast, half with outrage, half with something nameless. "They saved us," murmured the Scion, cobalt female again, more quietly now. "They saved you to say they could," Warden Crawl said, "to control the story, to say, look, we are kinder than our enemies, to make your emperor look cruel in comparison when he uses fire instead of bandages." The bronze hatchling shook himself, as if throwing off some clinging cobweb. "Then we will hate them," he declared, voice high but fierce. "We will never forget." Warden Crawl leaned down until his massive head was level with theirs. "Say it," he commanded. "Never trust the Terran," the brood chanted. "Never trust soft hands. Never trust human mercy." He listened until the words settled into the air and then into their bones. Only then did he extinguish the hologram with a flick of his claw. The nursery dimmed. In the sudden quiet, the smallest of the six, a runt with a pale, smoky hide and one frill slightly shorter than the other, let out a small, uncertain noise. "What if one is different?" it asked. "What if one doesn't lie?" The other hatchlings hissed, scandalized. The bronze male's tail lashed. The cobalt female snapped at the runt's ear. Not hard enough to break skin, but hard enough to sting. Warden Crawl stared at the little dragon for a long moment. "Then that one will die first," he said at last, voice like cooling iron. "Because the Empire cannot afford to guess." He stepped back, leaving the brood to curl around one another in the warmth of the nest. Above them, the constellations shifted slowly, marking the passage of an artificial day. The hatchlings closed their eyes one by one, their dreams full of fire and faceless enemies, human silhouettes standing in front of them like shadows they would never forgive. Far above the nursery, in orbit, Terran hospital ships continued their patient circuits around war-scarred worlds, lighting the dark with colors that looked nothing like fire and everything like stubbornness. The brood did not know their names yet. They only knew one thing with the absolute certainty of youth. Humans were to be hated. Humans were to be resisted. Humans were never to be allowed near their hearts. It was, Warden Crawl believed, a simple lesson. The galaxy, as always, had other ideas. The war on Valis III had ended, technically, 6 months ago. No one had informed the planet. The sky still wore the scars, long, dark contrails where ships had died, faint auroras where shields had failed and generators had spat their last. The ground was worse. Craters pocked the desert, some still rimmed with fused glass. Rusting wreckage lay half buried in the sand, like the bones of titans. Between these relics of glory, life tried to resume in the form of refugee camps and field hospitals, strung together by hope and stubborn logistics. Mara Ellen stepped out of the med tent into air that tasted of dust and antiseptic, and squinted up at the twin suns. She had been on Valis III for 8 weeks, had slept properly on perhaps 3 of those nights. She wore a faded Terran Medical Corps uniform, the once crisp emblem on her shoulder dulled by sweat, blood, and desert grit. Her hair was tied back in a haphazard knot. There were faint purple smudges beneath her eyes, the kind that you only earned by dragging lives back from the edge until your body forgot what off-duty meant. The camp sprawled around her, rows of prefabricated shelters, water tanks, power generators that coughed and hummed. Various species moved through the corridors of canvas and plastic, their different shapes and colors all undercut by the same exhausted posture. The only constant sound was the low murmur of pain and the beeping of monitors. Behind her, inside the tent, someone coughed hard enough to rattle their ribs. "Drink," Mara called over her shoulder, not bothering to turn. "All of you, If your urine isn't clear, I'm putting every one of you on IV fluids and you will hate it. Bossy, muttered Corin, the other senior medic on duty. Alive, she corrected. You're welcome. Her wrist comm vibrated against her skin. A sharp, insistent buzz. She tapped it with a knuckle. Hail, came the voice of Major Idowu, the camp commander. You near the eastern perimeter? Close enough, she said. What did you break? Nothing on our side, he said. A Dominion refugee shuttle came down hard in Sector C Drakkar Hull signature. It bounced. Half the wreckage is in the canyon. We're getting strange readings from the debris. Radiation? Unknown biosigns, Idowu said. Tiny, volatile, not matching any standard refugee profile. We've got Imperial liaison breathing down my neck, and our own scanners arguing with each other. I need eyes on the ground that know the difference between urgent and dramatic. You flatter me, she said dryly, already pivoting toward the armory crate for her field kit. I live in fear of your incident reports, he replied. You're with Lieutenant Corin and 2 security. No heroics. If the wreck is hot, you triage yourselves first. Understood? Under protest? Yes, she said. She grabbed her bag off a crate patched canvas, familiar weight, and checked its contents by touch. Bandages, trauma foam, portable scanner, emergency thermal blankets, a couple of protein bars she kept forgetting to eat. Corin intercepted her at the tent flap, pulling on a sand mask. Let me guess, he said. Major wants you to go stick your head in something that exploded. He gets sad if a day goes by without that, she said. Come on. They crossed the camp at a brisk walk, sand crunching under their boots. 2 security troopers fell in behind them, rifles slung, eyes scanning. At the perimeter, a portable gate hummed, shimmering faintly as it tried to pretend it was a real wall. Beyond the fence, the desert dropped away into a shallow canyon where old cargo stacks and newer wreckage lay in a chaotic sprawl. Smoke still drifted from one of the impacts further out. Sector C? Corin asked, checking his wrist. Down there, Mara said, spotting the scorched trail of a recent crash. Keep your masks on until we clear the air. They slid down the sandy slope, rocks shifting under their feet. Heat radiated from the broken hull of the shuttle ahead, the air shimmering with it. The ship had dug a long furrow in the ground before coming to rest half on its side. One wing crumpled like tinfoil. Smells like a hangover, Corin muttered, squinting through the smoke. Mara's scanner chirped at her hip. She pulled it free and swept it in a slow arc. Residual fuel, some nasty particulates, but survivable if we don't inhale like idiots, she said. Biosigns. The display flickered. On the grid, 3 small points flashed in the darker shadow of the wreck. Each pulse was rapid, uneven, weak. Not standard humanoid pattern, not anything she'd seen in local fauna surveys. 3, she said. Low mass, elevated temperature. They're either very sick or very wrong. 50 meters, under that forward section. Security moved ahead, clearing twisted metal with the practiced impatience of people who had learned that time and danger were often the same thing. Mara ducked under a spar, careful not to brush the still glowing edges. The interior of the shuttle was a mess. Buckled support beams, cracked panels, the sour smell of burned insulation. A few Dominion corpses lay where they had been flung by the impact, claws still clutching restraints that had failed them. Corin knelt by the nearest body, checking for any trace of life, then shook his head once. All gone, he said quietly. Not all, Mara said. Her scanner's signals spiked as she moved toward the back of the cabin. There, wedged behind a collapsed bulkhead and half buried in debris, was a pod. It was not Dominion design. It was smoother, more organic, its surface a seamless shell of pale material, etched with faint, glowing sigils. A hairline crack ran along one side, leaking a slow trickle of warm vapor into the cooler air of the wreck. Her breath caught. Oh, she said softly. Oh, that's new. Please tell me that's a coffee machine, Corin said. Bio-incubator, she said. Dragon make, high-end. This shouldn't be on a refugee shuttle. She pressed her gloved hand to the pod. It was hot. Her scanner beeped frantically. Inside, something scraped weakly. Corin's eyes widened behind his goggles. Please tell me you're not about to open that. Would you like to explain to the Imperial liaison that we left unknown neonates in a cracked pod to cook because we were nervous? She asked. I'll watch. You're terrifying, he said. Fine, but if I die, I'm haunting your coffee. Together they cleared the debris, blocking the hatch. The mechanism, damaged in the crash, resisted at first, then gave way with a soft hiss. The lid lifted, releasing a wash of air that smelled of minerals, blood, and something sharp and electric. Inside the pod lay 3 dragon hatchlings. They were smaller than the ones in the Imperial hollows, their bodies still damp in places, scales gleaming in an almost translucent sheen. Their limbs were tangled, wings half unfolded like crumpled parchment. Each one bore faint traces of royal crest markings along their spines. Their eyes were open. They stared up at the sudden light with a mixture of dazed terror and feral fury. Mara really saw their condition in a glance. Dry tongues, labored breaths, fine tremors running through their underdeveloped muscles, dehydration, shock, heat stress, not yet irreversible. Not yet, Mother of Corin whispered. The largest hatchling, bronze with darker mottling along its jawline, let out a hoarse hiss. Its pupils narrowed on Mara's face. It had never seen a Terran in person. It had seen 1,000 of them in training feeds. Its lips peeled back, exposing needle teeth. Smoke curled from its nostrils. Mara met its gaze. She was aware, distantly, that she was looking at something that could grow into a weapon capable of tearing small ships apart, that some Imperial officer somewhere would sell their soul twice to have these creatures back, that her entire career, her entire species' fragile truce with this empire, balanced on what she did in the next 30 seconds. Closer, she saw something else, the frantic flutter of its throat, the way its too large head trembled on its neck, the rawness in its eyes that had nothing to do with rage and everything to do with fear. You're late for your first checkup, she said. She reached in, slow, gloved hand open, palm up. The hatchling lunged. Its jaws snapped shut a breath away from her wrist, teeth clacking against the material. Its body convulsed with the effort. The other 2, smaller and paler, flinched and tried to push themselves deeper into the curve of the pod. Behind her, she heard security tense, safeties clicking off. Stand down, she said, without looking back. If anyone fires, they'll hit me first, and then you'll have to write so many forms, your grandchildren will feel them. You are touching Imperial bioassets, one of the troopers said, voice tight. We are not authorized. I'm touching 3 neonates in critical condition, she snapped. You are authorized to prevent me from being shredded. You are not authorized to let them die because you're afraid of paperwork. She turned back to the pod, softening her voice. I get it, she told the dragons. You hate me on principle. It's a popular opinion. The bronze hatchling's nostrils flared. It ashed a tiny puff of smoke at her mask. Very intimidating, she said. Now, hold still. She slipped her hand under its chest, feeling bones too delicate beneath overheated flesh. It tried to jerk away. She didn't grip tighter. She let it strain, claws scraping at her sleeve, wings flapping weakly. You can fight, she murmured, but the gravity is winning. Let me even the odds. Something in her tone, or perhaps the simple exhaustion of its small body, made the hatchling's resistance falter. Its head sagged against her wrist for a heartbeat. She took the opportunity to ease it out of the pod, cradling it against her chest. It was heavier than it looked. Heat soaked through her uniform. The second hatchling, cobalt-striped, tried to follow, then collapsed halfway, limbs splayed. She scooped it up with her free arm, grunting a little. The third, the smallest, remained curled at the bottom of the pod, breath so shallow she had to stare to see its sides move. Corin, she said, blanket. Now. He had already stripped one from his pack, snapping it. Open. Together they wrapped the 3 dragons in the insulated fabric, creating a lumpy, shifting bundle that wriggled and emitted faint, outraged squeaks. You're insane, Corin muttered. I respect it, but you're insane. Log that in my performance review, she said. Her scanner, pinned awkwardly between her elbow and the bundle, flickered warnings at her. Heart rates too fast. Body temperatures trending down now that they were out of the pod, but still perilously high. We don't have long, she said. We get them into the tent. We get fluids in them. We stabilize them. Then we figure out how to tell the liaison he left the Emperor's eggs in a ditch. Security exchanged horrified looks. You can't be sure they're royal, one said weakly. They're in a royal-grade pod, with royal-grade markers on their spines, she said. If they're not royal, someone has a very illegal sense of humor. Move. They climb back up the slope, Mara, clutching the blanket-wrapped hatchlings against her like a mother with triplets in a bar fight. The dragons shifted, claws pricking through fabric, tiny bodies trembling between fear and collapse. The bronze one, who had tried to bite her throat minutes ago, pressed its head instinctively against her sternum, where her heart hammered too fast. Yeah, she muttered, breathless. Mine's not in great shape either. By the time they reached the perimeter, the camp's alarm klaxons were already starting to wail. The Imperial liaison must have seen the crash on his own feeds. Imperial signals were flooding the local channels with coded demands. At the gate, a squad of Drakkar soldiers in polished armor waited, crest emblems gleaming. Their eyes went immediately to the bundle in her arms. One of them inhaled sharply, pupils flaring. Royal scent, he hissed. How dare you? How dare I carry them instead of leaving them to roast? She shot back. You're welcome. Now get out of my way. My patients are dying. The soldiers hesitated, instincts warring deference to their own chain of command versus the overwhelming urge not to be the one responsible for a royal neonate dropping dead in the dirt. Mara didn't slow. She walked through the small gap they left, forcing them to move or be trampled by one stubborn human holding their future. As she crossed into the shade of the med tent, the dragon's trembling eased fractionally. The cooler air, the familiar hum of machines, the rhythm of distant beeps and murmured orders, her world folded around them. Behind her, the Drakkar soldiers and Terran troopers hovered at the entrance, held back by the unspoken rule that whatever chaos reigned outside, the medbay was its own jurisdiction. Inside, Lieutenant Mara Ellen, who had been taught all her life that dragons hated humans and would tear them apart on sight, laid 3 royal hatchlings on a cot and reached for her tools. You don't have to like me, she told them, rolling up her sleeves. You just have to live. It was not the kind of speech that made it into history texts. The galaxy, however, would learn to mark that moment, the first calm touch, the first shared heartbeat, as the needle that began to unstitch a very old fear. The med tent swallowed the desert light and replaced it with its own, harsh, white, clinical. Under that unforgiving glow, 3 dragon hatchlings that had been raised on holos of human treachery lay on a standard-issue Terran cot that complained under their heat and weight. Lieutenant Ellen Hale, no one in the camp ever bothered with her first name. Hale, or simply Ellen, did the job worked on autopilot at first. Triage brain, not politics brain. She slid a heat pad under the blanket bundle, fingers careful not to snag newly formed scales. The hatchlings hissed at the unfamiliar sensation, claws flexing, tails whipping weakly. Their bodies were still, too hot from the incubator pod. The pad wasn't for warmth, so much as preventing the kind of rapid cooling that shocked small systems into collapse. Easy, Ellen murmured, more to their frantic nervous systems than to their ears. We're landing, not crashing. Corin hovered, ostensibly helping, but mostly trying not to stare at the way their eyes tracked every movement. You realize, he said under his breath, that if any of them sneezes plasma, this whole tent becomes a cautionary tale. If any of them sneezes plasma, that's a good sign, Ellen said. Means their glands work and they're not too dehydrated to waste water on theatrics. She opened a tray, grabbed a sterile syringe, hesitated, then set it aside. IV lines and uncooperative lizards, with teeth the size of her little fingers, felt like a terrible combination. Scanner, she said. Corin slapped it into her palm. She adjusted the settings, forcing the old unit to accept a new, Baseline. Imperial biology came with a stack of encrypted files the Terran Corps had been allowed to see only after too many peace treaties and too many war memorials. Ellen had read all of them on the transport over, the way other people read thrillers. The display flickered, then stabilized. Heart rates, high but holding, she muttered. Oxygen saturation low. That'll improve once we clear their airways. Body temps dropping from hell toward fever. We can work with this. The largest hatchling, the bronze male, let out a rasping sound that wanted to be a roar when it grew up. Ellen put a hand on his chest, feeling the frantic flutter of his heart against her palm. He froze. His pupils narrowed, fixing on her face. Her scent saturated the air this close. Human salt and recycled soap, iron from a healing cut on her wrist, the faint plastic tang of disposable gloves. To a hatchling nose trained on curated hatred, it should have been unbearable. Instead, layered beneath the unfamiliar, there was a pattern, the same smell that had been present in the canyon pod, steady and close, when water first touched a dry tongue. The scent that had surrounded him as he'd been lifted out of the wreck, pressed against a chest whose heartbeat thundered with terror and refusal to yield. Recognition flickered behind his eyes like a faulty spark. He snapped at her hand anyway. His jaws closed around the thick fabric of her glove, teeth dimpling but not piercing. Ellen did not jerk away. She let him clamp down, meeting his gaze steadily. "Yeah," she said calmly. "We're both having a bad day." He held on, tremors running through his jaw. Then, as his exhausted muscles failed him, his bite loosened. He let go with an annoyed huff, as if realizing that human stubbornness had worse taste than he'd expected. Ellen used the moment to slip the oxygen mask she'd jury-rigged, originally designed for feline patients, over his snout. He jerked once, but the first trickle of cool, enriched air touched his lungs and survival instincts overruled pride. The second hatchling, Cobalt with the silver spinal stripe, watched this betrayal of principle with offended fascination. When Ellen moved toward her, she reared back on unsteady forelimbs and flared her frill as much as her weak neck allowed. "Beautiful," Ellen murmured. 10 out of 10 intimidation. I'm definitely not still moving." She brought the mask closer. The cobalt hatchling hissed, then inhaled by accident. Oxygen slid across overstressed lung tissue. The hiss faltered. The frill drooped by a millimeter. Ellen eased the mask on. The third, the smoky runt, lay closest to the cot's edge, curled into itself, tremors barely visible. Its eyes were slits, gaze unfocused. She didn't offer it a mask yet. Its breathing was shallow but not obstructed. For this one, fluids were a priority. "Corin," she said, "I need the smallest gauge we've quote." "Con. Pediatric?" he asked. "Smaller if we had it," she said. "We don't. So pediatric." He handed her the kit, mouth set. "You know the liaison is going to have a stroke when he finds out you ran Terran fluids into Imperial royalty. If he wants to argue, he can bring a journal article arguing in favor of alternative treatments," Ellen said. "Also, he can get in line." She cleaned a thin stretch of skin along the smoky hatchling's forelimb, whispering nonsense as she worked. Her words weren't magic, but the sound, low, even, calm, occupied the part of her own brain that wanted to panic. It also, incidentally, gave the hatchling something to focus on that wasn't the sting of the needle. The vein collapsed the first time she tried. She exhaled, waited, warmed the limb between her hands, and tried again. This time, the cannula slid home. A bead of dark, iridescent blood swelled in the chamber, then retreated as the line started to flow. "There we go," she murmured. "You can hate me later. Right now, you drink." For the next hour, the world narrowed to the cot. She adjusted lines, watched numbers tick on monitors, added improvised formula to a feeding tube, and coaxed it past tiny, stubborn jaws. She wiped drool from scales, cleaned abrasions, checked pupils with a penlight. She kept her voice level, even when the bronze hatchling convulsed in a burst of terrified strength that nearly flung the mask off, even when the smoky one's pulse stuttered in her fingers and then rebounded. Around them, The tent's usual chaos churned, other medics calling out for assistance, translators repeating symptoms in 3 languages, the occasional shout of, "Clear!" and the ugly crackle of a defibrillator doing its work. The air smelled of disinfectant trying and failing to overpower the underlying smell of too many bodies in too little space. The hatchlings filtered all of that through their own fear. Their senses screamed at them. Unnatural light, mechanical beeps, the layered sense of dozens of species, the proximity of the despised human smell. Every lesson from the nursery hammered along their nerves. Do not trust the Terran. Do not let them close. But nerve pathways were young, malleable. New data hammered back. The Terran did not leave. She did not strike them when they tried to bite. She did not yank tubes out when they thrashed. She did not shout, except at others on their behalf. When their hearts faltered, her hand tightened, not to restrain, but to insist. When they sagged, her voice threaded through the noise and anchored them like gravity. Slowly, the storm inside their small bodies began to ebb. The bronze hatchling's breathing evened out, still fast but less ragged. The cobalt one's tail stopped lashing and began, grudgingly, to curl. The smoky runt's tremors reduced to occasional shivers that matched the rhythm of the fluids dripping into its veins. Night fell. Outside the tent, though the hatchlings didn't see it. The desert's temperature dropped like a stone thrown into deep water. The generators hummed harder. Somewhere in the camp, wind picked up, rattling the tent's frame, making the lights flicker. Ellen set a hand flat on the cot as the floor vibrated. "Storm's back," she muttered. "Of course it is," a medic at the neighboring station grumbled. "Power grids don't like sandblasting." Who knew? The first gust hit like a physical blow. The tent's fabric snapped. The lights dimmed, surged, then cut out completely. Darkness slammed down, dense and immediate. The tent went quiet for one fractured heartbeat. Then the emergency lanterns kicked in, bathing the space in a softer, amber glow. The machine switched to battery backup with a chorus of warning beeps. It was enough for the humans. For the hatchlings, whose world had already contracted to heat and sound and one repeating scent, the sudden change in pitch and brightness was a fresh attack. All 3 jerked as one. The bronze hatchling tore the mask off with a panicked rip, teeth bared. The cobalt one flattened against the blanket, frill pressed tight to her neck, eyes blown wide. The smoky runt's heart rate spiked so fast the monitor shrieked a warning. Ellen's own adrenaline surged. She clamped down on it. "Hey!" she said, leaning over them. Hands out but not grabbing. "Hey! Look at me! Listen!" The bronze hatchling snapped blindly at the air. His teeth clipped the edge of her sleeve and scraped skin. She didn't pull back. Instead, she did something very simple and very stupid. She laid her right hand over her own chest. The hatchlings watched, panting, every muscle wired for flight they weren't strong enough to execute. Ellen thumped her chest lightly, once, twice, then again, finding a steady cadence. "In," she said, inhaling through her nose. 2, out, 4. She exaggerated the breaths, letting her ribs expand visibly under her hand, then fall. "In, 2, she repeated. "Out, 4, with me." It was not a technique from any dragon handling manual. It was something she'd used on human children in bombed-out wards, on panicked soldiers stuck under rubble, on herself in supply closets when too many body bags arrived in one day. Her voice cut through the tense murmur. Some part of the hatchling's hindbrain latched onto the rhythm despite itself. It was the same beat they'd heard in the canyon, not from her chest, but amplified through her shout when she'd hauled them free. The same cadence that had woven through the shuttle as she'd staggered back up the slope. In, 2, out, 4. The bronze hatchling's breath hitched. Then, reluctantly, it began to follow. His chest rose on her count, fell on her exhale. The cobalt one, ever the cautious observer, watched both of them, then matched the pattern after a few beats, as if checking the math. The smoky, runt's pulse, which had been a jagged line on the monitor, smoothed fractionally. Its eyes, glazed with fear, fixed on the place where her hand met her sternum. The sound of her heart, not loud, not especially regular, but persistent, filled its head. Ellen didn't stop until the warning alarm on the monitor downgraded from shriek to annoyed beep and finally, grudgingly, to silence. "Good," she said, soft enough that the word was more a sigh than a sound. "There we go. Hate me all you like. Just breathe with me while you do it." Time blurred. At some point, Corin thrust a mug of lukewarm coffee into her free hand. She drank it without tasting it. The storm outside howled. The tent creaked. But inside this small radius of cot and blanket and 3 improbable patients, a fragile equilibrium held. Hours later, when the worst of the storm had passed, and the camp had sunk into the exhausted quiet of the very late night, the hatchling's fury finally ran out. The bronze, one's eyelids drooped, then snapped open again as if outraged by its own fatigue. The cobalt one watched sleep creep up on its brother with judgment, and then succumbed a heartbeat later. The smoky runt fought the longest, eyes tracking her hand as it rested now on the blanket between them, fingers unconsciously tapping microbeats. Eventually, even it had to choose. Its small body, still lined to a fluid bag and half swaddled in excess blanket, inched toward the warmest source it knew. The blanket shifted. A tiny head bumped her ribs. Claws snagged her uniform and then relaxed. The bronze hatchling, feeling the movement, rolled without waking properly and landed half across her lap. The cobalt female, unwilling to be excluded from any defensive formation, oozed sideways until she lay against Ellen's stomach, her snout nestled into the crease of the medic's elbow. Ellen considered moving them back into a neat row. Her spine ached. Her legs were numb from hours of unnatural posture. But the moment she tried to slide her arm away, the smoky runt made a small, distressed sound, and the bronze clamped a foreclaw onto the fabric of her shirt, pinning her. She surrendered. Carefully, she shifted until her back met the wall of the tent. Her legs stretched along the cot's edge, creating more of a lap. The hatchlings flowed into the new shape like liquid, finding every available inch, their combined warmth bleeding into her through tired muscles. "Congratulations," she told them quietly. "You've domesticated a Terran." No one answered. Their breaths deepened, small bodies rising and falling in a rhythm that almost matched her own. As she finally let her eyes close, Ellen thought not for the first time that she had no idea how she was going to explain this to command, the liaison, or any Imperial officer with a pulse. She also thought that she would rather be yelled at by every admiral in the sector than move and break the fragile trust, pressed against her chest. Outside, the sky over Valis 3 wore the flickering scars of war. Inside one overworked med tent, 3 hatchlings who had been raised on holographic hatred slept on a human's heartbeat as if it were the only safe sound in the galaxy. No one had yet come to see. That would change before dawn. Warden Krall had flown through plasma storms that peeled armor from ships and stared down capital guns without blinking. The summons that had dragged him from Carviriel to a dusty ceasefire world made his surviving eye burn in a way no battle had. Royal brood, the Emperor's message had said. No titles, no ceremonial phrasing, just those 2 words, transmitted on the oldest, most secure channel in the Empire. Lost in transit. Vector intercept places them near Valis 3. Go. No one else was old enough to remember the last time a royal clutch had been threatened. No one else had earned the right, through victories and failures alike, to walk into a Terran camp and tell both sides to stand down while he looked for his children. Children, he thought reluctantly as his shuttle knifed into Valis 3's atmosphere. The word sat strange in his mind, unused, like an old weapon pulled out of storage. He preferred brood, assets, future wing, words that made grief optional. The shuttle buffeted in the lingering storm currents. Below, the camp's lights resolved into a cluster of artificial stars in the red dust. Beyond it, the canyon scar where the refugee shuttle had died glowed faintly on his HUD. A scent sample, transmitted from local scanners, threaded through the shuttle's recycled air. Hatchling, fresh, fear sweat, nest fluid, Terran. His lips peeled back from his teeth. He had seen humans up close only 3 times. Once across a battlefield, when a Terran captain had ordered her troops to stop firing while they pulled wounded Drakkar out of a collapsed trench. Once, through the scope of a gunship, when he'd been ordered to target a human hospital ship and had refused. Once more, in the Hall of Crowns, when peace had been signed by leaders who shook hands with careful disdain. He had never forgotten the smell, iron, adrenaline, and the stubborn refusal to die. That smell was now wrapped around the scent of his brood. As the shuttle landed on the camp's designated pad, clouds of dust billowed. Terran security teams formed a perimeter, weapons held low but not relaxed. The Imperial liaison, crest rumpled, eyes hollow from too little sleep and too many reports, stood at the edge of the landing zone, hands clasped in a posture of high-tension diplomacy. The ramp hissed down. Krall descended without fanfare. He wore no ceremonial armor, only the light, scarred plating he favored for real work. His presence bent the air. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. "Warden Krall," the liaison said, bowing low. Where? Krall interrupted. "Are they? No titles. No pleasantries." The liaison swallowed. "The royal biosignatures appeared within the med tent shortly after we retrieved them from the crash site," he said. "They remained there." The Terran medics intervened. "Intervened," Krall repeated, as if tasting a rancid word. "They claim critical condition," the liaison added quickly. "Our own sensors confirm significant stress." Krall's tail twitched, scoring shallow gouges in the packed earth. "You allowed Terrans to touch the Emperor's brood." "I lack the authority to physically prevent a triage officer on her own ground," the liaison said, very carefully choosing phrases that spread blame thin. "And if I had, they likely would have died before you arrived." Krall inhaled once, sharply, drawing in the camp's smells. Dust, fuel, metal, old blood, a dozen species, fear and fatigue. Underneath it all, distinct and inescapable, hatchling. And laced through that olive soap, synthetic fabric, heat, human sweat that tasted of caffeine and sleep deprivation. He exhaled a thin stream of smoke. "Take me," he said. They moved through the camp at a pace that made Terran soldiers step back in a hurry. Krall kept his head low enough that his horns didn't rip canvas roofs, but every part of his bearing radiated controlled violence. Guards watched him with the horrified fascination reserved for predators on leashes that might not hold. At the threshold of the main med tent, he stopped. The smell hit him like a physical blow. Brood in distress, brood in... His nostrils flared. His jaw worked once, twice. In contentment, he pushed through the flap. The tent quieted, the way rooms do when something enters that rewrites the hierarchy. Monitors still beeped. Patients still groaned. Medics still moved. But the sound dampened as attention drew inward like a lens. Krall's remaining eye adjusted to the dimmer, amber emergency lighting. He took in the rows of cots, the tangle of equipment, the overlapping forms of wounded from both sides. He ignored them all. At the far end of the tent, in a corner not designed for ceremony or revelation, he saw them. 3 hatchlings, his hatchlings, lay sprawled across the chest and lap of a seated human. The Terran medic, small by his standards, young even by hers, was slumped against the tent's support pole, chin on her chest, eyes closed in the heavy, graceless sleep of the utterly exhausted. Her hair was coming loose from its knot. Her uniform was stained and torn. She looked, Krall thought distantly, like someone who had given too much of herself to strangers and forgotten where the boundaries were supposed to be. The bronze male hatchling lay diagonally across her torso, head tucked under her jaw. One of his tiny foreclaws rested possessively on the center of her chest, directly over the steady, audible thump of her heart. His breath puffed against her throat in warm, damp gusts. The cobalt female had claimed her lap, coiled there with her tail wrapped around the medic's waist, snout pressed into the crook of Ellen's elbow. Every exhale made the human's fingers twitch faintly, as if some part of her refused to stop monitoring even in sleep. The smoky runt, always the smallest, always the one he had worried would fail. The egg lay between them, pressed along the line of Ellen's ribs, head rising and falling with each of her breaths, as if synced. They were not restrained. There were no leashes, no neural clamps, no sonic dampeners. The only things holding them in place were tangled blanket, gravity, and the unconscious reach of their claws whenever she shifted. Every piece of training Kral had hammered into their young skulls: never trust the Terran, never lower your guard, never expose your throat to soft hands lay in a crumpled heap on that cheap canvas cot. He felt the eyes of the tent on him. Terran medics poised to throw themselves in front of their patients, Imperial guards ready to lunge if he so much as growled, the liaison holding his breath so hard Kral could hear cartilage creak. For a moment, no one moved. The bronze hatchling twitched in his sleep, eyes flickering beneath thin lids. A dream wrinkled his muzzle. His claws flexed against Ellen's chest, testing shadows for threats that did not materialize. Her hand, lax against the blanket, curled reflexively toward him. Kral took a step forward. The floor vibrated. At the third step, Ellen's survival instincts dragged her partway to consciousness. Her eyelids fluttered. She woke the way people in war zones do. Not with a start, but with a slow climb through layers of exhaustion toward awareness. Her eyes found him. For a heartbeat, they were uncomprehending, reflecting only light and the question, "Where am I?" Then she focused, and comprehension flooded in. She saw the scars, the armor, the rank markings cut into his crest, the visible recognition of the brood's warden. She did not scramble away. There was nowhere to go that wouldn't dislodge her patience. Instead, she tightened her grip around them, just slightly, muscles tensing to put herself between them and whatever would come through her. It was so absurd that Kral almost laughed. "You are Ellen Hale," he said, using the liaison's earlier briefing. His voice filled the tent like a low drum. "Lieutenant," she said automatically, then seemed to realize she was correcting a creature who could bite her in half. "Yes, sir. You have something of mine," he said. "Three somethings," she said hoarsely, then winced at her own mouth. "They were dying when we found them. They're less dying now." He could smell the truth in that. Her fatigue, the stale chemical tang of adrenaline come and gone, the underlying satisfaction that curled in people when a patient pulled away from the edge. The bronze hatchling stirred properly this time, dragged toward wakefulness by the vibration of Kral's voice. His eyes opened, pupils narrow slits against the tense light. For a moment, he looked up at the vast shape in the doorway, scent receptors flaring. Warden Kral, nursery smell, old authority, battlefield and ash and the echo of drills. The little dragon's frill lifted halfway, unsure whether to flatten in submission or flare in defense. His claws tightened on Ellen's chest. Then Ellen's heart beat against his palm again, steady and imperfect and familiar. The hatchling made a small, confused sound. Very carefully, while still watching Kral, he shuffled higher up onto the medic's torso and tucked his head under her chin, pressing the sensitive scales of his throat into direct contact with her skin. Kral's eye widened a fraction. That was a gesture no drill had ever taught them. It was instinct, buried deep. Expose your most vulnerable part, only to nest, to warmth, to that which is synonymous with safe. The cobalt, female, woken by the shift, cracked one eye open. She, too, scented Kral and the Imperial Guard and the latent threat of half a dozen weapons, and made her choice. She tightened her tail around Ellen's waist and let out a low, warning hum that, if her vocal cords had been fully developed, would have become a proper growl. The smoky runt woke last, as always. Its eyes opened slowly. It looked from Kral to Ellen, then back again. It did not move from its position along her ribs. If anything, it pressed closer, as if to say, "Whoever you are, I have already picked my gravity well." The tent had gone silent enough that Kral could hear the faint, whining struggle of one of the portable generators outside. "They were raised to hate you," he said slowly, the words directed to Ellen but pitched for everyone. "I saw to it myself. Holos, drills, stories. I put Terran faces in their dreams, so that they would never hesitate when told to burn you. Ellen swallowed. You did a thorough job, she said. You were almost their last memory. Discomfort flickered along his spine, a sensation he did not often entertain. And yet, he continued, here we are, she echoed. Her voice was steadying now, the initial shock giving way to something wry. If it helps, they hated me at first. We reached an agreement. They breathe. I ignore the fact that my lap has been annexed by a foreign power. Why did you not surrender them to our troops immediately? The liaison blurted, unable to keep silent any longer. Protocol requires me to not let patients crash because someone with a pretty crest tells me to, Ellen said, not taking her eyes off Kral. By the time your men arrived, we already had lines in and core temps dropping. Moving them then would have undone all of it. So you decided, Kral said, to keep the Emperor's brood on your chest. That part was not in the plan, she admitted. They were shaking. I was here. Gravity did the rest. The bronze hatchling, as if to underscore her point, shifted again and released a small, satisfied grumble. His breath warmed the hollow of her throat. Her hand, without conscious permission, came up to rest between his shoulder blades. Fingers splayed over the delicate plates. Kral watched the motion with an expression that had no name in the usual imperial lexicon. It was not pure anger, nor pure awe. It was something like the precise moment a blade meets an unexpected obstacle, and instead of shattering, flexes. Behind him, one of the imperial guards whispered, horrified, they imprint on her. What if they refuse commands? What if they refuse stupid commands? Ellen said before anyone could stop her. Fatigue had sanded down her internal filter. That's usually called good judgment, where I'm from. Every Drakkar in the tent stiffened. The Terrans went utterly still. Kral's tail lashed once, then stilled. Do you know, he said, almost conversationally, what we expected to find when we traced their scent here? Ellen's mouth twisted. An atrocity, she said quietly. Or at least, a mess. Yes, he said. We expected to confirm our teachings, that humans are, at best, inconveniences, and at worst, thieves of destiny, that you would have strapped them to your machines, sampled their blood, broken their wings to see how they heal, that their first sight of your kind would be a lab. He lowered himself, slowly, until his head was level with the cot. Up close, Ellen could see the fine cracks in his scales, the old scar tissue around his blinded eye, the way his armor had been patched and repatched over the years. He smelled of metal, singed ozone, and something else, tiredness, that had grown so old it had forgotten its name. Instead, he said, I find them cuddled. The word sounded foreign in his mouth, as if he'd borrowed it from a children's story he didn't believe in. Napping, he added, because precision was important in war, and apparently, in whatever this was. The smoky runt, sensing a large presence very close, lifted its head and sniffed. Kral did not move. The little dragon's nostrils flared, sorting scent into categories. Old nest, battle, authority, familiar from holograms and from the egg's last days of hearing Warden Kral's voice through shell. Safe, but in the way that sharp rocks are safe. Predictable, not warm. It considered that. Then it turned and bumped its head once, firmly, against Ellen's sternum, as if to clarify for all parties present where warm resided. A sound rippled through the tent. On the Terran side, someone smothered a laugh with the back of their hand. On the Imperial side, someone else swallowed a word that might have been sacrilege or grudging admiration. Kral exhaled, a long stream of air that carried no flame. Very well, he said. The nursery is wrong, or I am, or the war has twisted us so much that hatchlings see clearer than their elders. His gaze sharpened. You will come with them, he said to Ellen. It was not a request. They clearly believe you are part of their nest. Until that delusion is proven harmful, the Empire will indulge it. She blinked. You're taking me to Car Virael, to the Emperor's flagship first. he said. Then, perhaps, home. He will want to see the human whose heartbeat overruled my training. The liaison made a small choking noise that might have been diplomacy dying. Ellen looked down at the three small, warm weights pinning her, looked up at the warden whose entire worldview was currently reorganizing itself in front of her, looked sideways at Corin, who had the decency not to say anything out loud, though the expression on his face suggested he was mentally composing 6 dramatic letters to headquarters. "Well," she said softly, "I suppose I was due for some shore leave." The bronze hatchling cracked one eye open again at the change in her tone. He saw Krall, Old Authority, and the Imperial Guard, and the Terran soldiers, and the hundreds of futures balancing on a cot that wasn't designed for any of this. Then he pressed closer to Ellen's throat and went back to sleep. Warden Krall, who had once believed he could pour hatred into bone and have it stay there forever, bowed his head, a fraction not to the human, not to the tent, but to the quiet, unbearable fact in front of him. The brood did not hate humans. They hated being alone. And somehow, impossibly, against every warning he had ever given them, they had decided that one young Terran medic counted as theirs. The galaxy was going to have to adjust. The dropship's hull thrummed like a low drum as it clawed up through the last ragged fingers of storm. Ellen sat strapped to a bulkhead and pretended the harness was comfortable with 3 dragon hatchlings arranged across her like living luggage. The bronze male occupied her shoulders and chest as if he'd bought the seat. The cobalt female had wedged into her lap with a proprietary tail around her waist. The smoky runt lay diagonally across both, nose pressed into the seam of her jacket as if scent alone could guarantee survival. Opposite, Warden Krall looked carved from meteor iron, the kind of stillness only predators achieve. The Imperial troopers around him wore the expression of professionals trying not to stare at a miracle in case it demanded paperwork. The ramp yawned open into the belly of the Emperor's flagship, and the air changed from desert dust to something cool and mineral-scented. The ship's architecture, grown as much as forged, flowed around them in rippling ribs of dark alloy. Drones drifted like curious fish, lenses irising wider as they registered 3 very small, very illegal facts arranged on a human. "Keep your pace," Krall said quietly, as if to both Ellen and fate. "If they think we're uncertain, they will try to make us prove otherwise." "Who's they?" Ellen asked. "The ship, the court, old habits," he said. "You will meet all 3 at once." They did abruptly. The corridor opened into a chamber that was neither throne room nor lab, and somehow both. A shallow, circular basin, surrounded by tiers of armor and silk. At its far edge stood Vrintor, Emperor of the Drakkar, wearing the ship's shadow like a cloak. He did not bother with a crown. Gravity did that for him. He did not speak first. He inhaled, slow, tasting the air like a truth he intended to cross-examine. The hatchlings felt the scent of their line roll over them, iron, starlight, a memory of shell and heat. First instinct said home. Second instinct said be small. Third instinct, newest and loudest, said find the heartbeat. The bronze male chuffed, indecisive, and then tucked himself tighter into Ellen's collarbone. A murmur rippled through the tiers. Vrinter's eyes, molten amber lit from within, flicked to Krall, then to Ellen, then to the tiny white claws kneading the fabric over a Terran sternum. "You carry my line," he said at last, voice low enough to make instruments check their calibration. "I'm a medic," Ellen answered, because truth was easier to keep track of than strategy. They were crashing. Technicians approached with tools that glowed and hummed with the confidence of tradition. Krall's crest twitched. Ellen saw something like regret pass through the Emperor's posture, then harden into resolve. With a small turn of his wrist, Vrintor sent the devices away. "Not leashes," he said, almost to himself. "Not today." A hiss snapped through the chamber as a side door irised open. A robed advisor glided in, flanked by guards with clean rifles and cleaner consciences. "Sire," the advisor began smoothly, "Terran proximity at this stage will contam." He never finished the sentence. The floor under them boomed one sound out of time, with the ship's engines, and the lights stuttered. A harsh, cold warning note vibrated the air. Somewhere along the outer ring, a section of hull tried to become a door the hard way. "Boarders!" Kral said, already moving. "Close ranks!" The Guardians surged to the breach. A squad of sleek, matte figures in outsider armor poured through the forced seam, blades hot and quiet. They weren't pirates. They moved like a cult, precise and fervent, one zeal only. No human hands on royal blood. "Keep down!" Someone hissed at Ellen as a blast shield unrolled from the ceiling. She crouched instinctively, but the hatchlings did not cooperate with hiding. The cobalt female hissed, frill spreading. The runt stiffened against Ellen's ribs, and the bronze, who had been born for 1,000 glorious choices that were still years away, made a small, furious sound that would one day be a battle cry. He didn't leap. He pressed, shoving his snout harder into the hollow of Ellen's throat, as if to nail his definition of safe to the moment. Kral hit the line of intruders like a story told to frighten steel. 2 fell before they saw what had moved. A third raised a blade toward the basin, toward the Terran, and the bundle in her arms, and got as far as a step. Ellen's world tunneled. She didn't have a weapon. She had a trauma kit and bad habits. She snapped a canister of seal foam off her belt, thumbed the safety, and flung herself sideways between tiers, driving the nozzle into the intruder's visor and flooding it with expanding polymer. The figure convulsed, blinded, stumbled backward into Kral's waiting claw, and ceased to be a problem. "Terran improvisation," the praetor muttered somewhere behind Vrintor, equal parts horrified and impressed. Another boarder darted, low and clever, toward Ellen's unguarded flank. The cobalt hatchling moved first, pure reflex. No training, lashing her tail across his wrist. It wasn't strong. It was surprising. He flinched. Ellen slammed her shoulder into his knee and learned that some physics are universal. He fell. Imperial guards finished the math. Silence returned the way it always does after violence, in small, embarrassed steps. SEAL drones swarmed the rent hull with the competence of repentant surgeons. The intruder's gear, stripped and tagged, already looked like evidence instead of ideology. Vrintor hadn't moved from the edge of the basin. He had simply extended one hand, claws barely out, ready to be the last wall if all the others broke. Now he lowered it and studied Ellen as if she had just introduced a new verb to his language. "You understand," he said, calm as an indictment, "that you just taught my brood a lesson I did not plan. That foam washes out," Ellen said, adrenaline still hammering. "Eventually, you showed them that humans do not merely stay," he continued, a hint of heat at the core of each word. "You stand. You interpose. You become part of the geometry between threat and small life." Ellen's breath hitched. She felt suddenly aware of every frayed thread on her sleeves. "I didn't think about it," she said. "I don't have a philosophy. I have patience." "Then we will steal your lack of philosophy," Vrintor said dryly. "Kral." The old warden stepped forward, talons clicking softly on grown metal. He looked almost abashed under the weight of what he'd seen. "Sire, write what she did. Write how she breathed for them. Write the part where she did not run," Vrintor said. "Teach it. Call it whatever makes soldiers listen." "Breath cadence protocol," the praetor offered, pen already moving. "Guardian stance. Human shield doctrine. No, that will play poorly. Call it common sense and write it in gold," Vrintor said. He faced Ellen, fully, and the court's temperature rose a degree. "Lieutenant Ellen Hale of Terra, the brood has decided you belong in their radius. I am not fool enough to argue with mathematics that saves me wars. By imperial decree, you are keeper of the royal brood until either party fires you." The tears reacted some relief, some disbelief, a few quiet, furious calculations being redone in real time. Kral's crest lowered half an inch in what, on any other face, would have been a smile. Ellen looked down. 3 small dragons blinked up at her, breathing in the same stuttering pattern she'd hammered into the storm and into their nerves. The bronze bumped her chin with his forehead, annoyed that she had stopped petting him to become a constitutional crisis. "Keeper," she said softly, tasting the word, knowing it would do stupid things to her life. Keeper, Vrinter affirmed. Bring them to the nursery. He turned, and an empire turned with him. The palace remembered breath. It had smelled 3 tiny heartbeats once, and then the absence that followed. When the emperor returned at a measured walk with Kral at his shoulder, and a human in scuffed Medcore boots carrying the future like a question, the nursery warmed by a fraction in archaic reflex. The star-glass basin lay where it had always been, an exquisite cradle tuned to the thermodynamics of dragon neonates and the vanity of a court. Priests ringed the threshold with bowls of clean smoke and older worries. Engineers hunched over consoles, frowning at readings that meant nothing to their models and everything to 3 small bodies. Place them, Vrintor said. Ellen knelt and unwound the thermal blanket. The hatchlings slid into the nest like drops of water finding their level, scuffing tiny claws against the glass. Instinct tugged in 2 directions. Explore the geometry their bones remembered from egg days, and get back to the portable heartbeat that had become a definition. The bronze compromised. 1 foreclaw on the rim, the rest of him draped across Ellen's shin. The cobalt pretended to evaluate the heating array with grave academic interest, and then arranged her spine along the exact line where nest warmth and Ellen warmth met. The smoky runt circled twice and collapsed with its nose pressed to her boot. Whispers hissed around the room. The high priest cleared his throat with the careful sorrow of a man about to say something he expected to be ornate and necessary. Sire, ritual requires the living, Vrinter said. Everything else is manners. Kral stepped up beside Ellen and, with solemn fussiness, set a stool where a throne would have been in older stories. He did not look at her as he did it. He looked at the hatchlings, and the new angle of his jaw said he had accepted several amendments to his soul. Lieutenant, he said, if you teach, I will learn. She blinked at him. Teach what? How you made their lungs choose rhythm over panic, he said gruffly. How you talk them into ignoring fear long enough to swallow. How you stay when staying feels like being a wall with skin. Ellen swallowed against the sudden, hot ache of being taken seriously by the scariest adult in the room. It's not complicated, she said, but it isn't easy. You can't fake it. Then we will not, Kral said simply. The court, unused to watching humility without an execution at the end, stood very still. Vrintor lifted 1 dragon at a time, with the exact slowness of someone who no longer trusts ceremony to tell him what to do. The bronze sniffed his palm and allowed it. The cobalt flicked her tongue thoughtfully and allowed it. The smoky runt checked Ellen's knee and then permitted an imperial hand to claim the other half of its weight. Persons of the crown, Vrinter said, not loudly, but in the tone that writes itself into law. Not property. Whoever engineered a Khan said it, theft will be found and faced. But we will not repay a sin of possession with more possession. The praetor's stylus scratched. Courtiers struggled not to mutter the word heresy where the acoustics would enjoy it. A general stared at his boots and found them fascinating. A messenger, young Scales, bright with terrified purpose, skidded to a halt at the threshold and bowed so hard her crest clicked. Sire, the intruder's gear insignia of the Purity Conclave. A splinter sect. Their recordings, they broadcast a credo. Keep royal fire feral untainted by soft hands. They meant to purge the brood if the human remained. The room tightened, a collective wince at the ugliness of convictions, dressed as cleanliness. Kral's old scars flared pale. They chose hatred as a purity test, he said. They would have failed it if they had ever been allowed a cradle. Then our answer is built, Vrintor said. We will raise warriors who can do calculus with their rage, and caregivers who can pick up a dragon without bleeding. He turned to Ellen. Name it. The thing you want built, so this is not a miracle that dies when you sleep. Training, she said. The word easier this time. Cross-species neonatal core. Start here, then everywhere. Not leash tech, presence, hands, protocols that begin with breathe. People who can sit in a storm and bully a heart into cooperating. Put them in the chain of command, so generals cannot ignore them when it's inconvenient. The emperor laughed brief. Dangerous. Delighted. Keeper, he said. You have a talent for specific mutiny. Done. An aide fainted very quietly behind a pillar. No one checked on him. The hatchlings had found better things. The bronze discovered that the priest's tassels were exactly the right texture for chewing and set to work with scholarly focus. The cobalt, after investigating a diagnostic array with her tongue and disliking its taste, climbed the lip of the nest, kicked once, and coasted in an undignified 2-meter glide that had engineers spontaneously recalibrating calculations to include cute. The smoky runt, finished with Ellen's boot, toddled to the emperor's wrist, put one paw on it, and then, because ethics are easier when you're small and honest, reached back with the other paw to keep touching Ellen's knee at the same time. The room exhaled. Someone laughed, the fragile, astonished kind that happens when a future refuses to be grim on schedule. Kral made a rough sound in his throat that only barely wasn't a purr. Ellen sat, finally, because Kral's stool was a decree and because her legs were starting to shake now that no one needed them to be steel. The bronze immediately reversed course and oozed back into her lap. The cobalt took the high ground of her thigh and glared at a protocol officer who glared back and lost. The runt flopped so hard against her shin that the nest chimed. Keeper, Vrinter said again, and this time the court did not flinch at the title. You have dragged a door open with both hands. It will not close. Some will hate you for that. Some will write songs. Both are tedious. In the hours between, there will be work. I know, Ellen said. I brought a pen. It was a ridiculous answer, and it was exactly right. Kral huffed approval in his dialect. The praetor, smiling like a conspirator who has found their favorite new crime, lifted his stylus and waited. Begin, Vrinter said. So Ellen did. She showed them how to count breaths out loud without sounding like they were counting. She put the emperor's hand and Kral's claw against their own chests and made them feel the cadence she demanded of frightened bodies. She corrected posture the way nurses correct generals, with gentle contempt and a look that assumes compliance. The court watched the oddest lesson in imperial history, might and medicine, learning the same song. Outside, the city buzzed with the first rumors of a Terran in the nursery. In barracks and shrines and noisy kitchens, the story mutated at the speed of hope. On the flagship, engineers integrated breath cadence protocol into the training sim framework with resigned admiration. In a dozen command posts, the Purity Conclave's crest lit up on walls as a problem that would be addressed with more intelligence and less theater than usual. In the nest, 3 definitions of enemy slept on, their rib cages rising and falling to a rhythm borrowed from a mammal who refused to be impressed by titles. When the lesson paused, Kral stood very still, then bent his massive head until his forehead touched the rim of the nest in a gesture older than conquest. It wasn't a bow. It was something like relief made visible. You were wrong, Ellen said softly, because honest men deserved honest women. About what hatred can do in bone. Kral's single eye gleamed. Yes, he said, and I will be remembered for the correction, not the mistake. Vrintor looked at the two of them, old war and obstinate care, and something complicated and useful settled into his shoulders. So, he said almost lightly, we raise them on drills and lullabies both. Ellen smiled, small and tired, and utterly unafraid. Start with the lullabies, she said. Drills are easier when you already know where home is. The bronze hatchling snored, undiplomatically loud, and all 3 adults, the emperor, the warden, and the keeper laughed the same surprised, surrendered laugh. The nursery, which had once taught a generation to clench, learned very slowly, very carefully, how to unclench. And somewhere deeper than doctrine, a new rule wrote itself into the empire's living walls. When a heartbeat teaches you to breathe, you listen.